allows for this. But they're focusing on the money issue, as Reverend Jackson and other early civil rights leaders did as well. So they saw economic autonomy as going hand in hand with civil rights. So this is Malcolm X. Why should white, and of course a black nationalist, that makes sense. Why should white people be running the banks of our community? So he wants autonomy. But let me be clear here. When Malcolm X was talking about autonomy, he saw the ghetto as a colony. Okay? He linked up the black ghetto with the anti-colonialization efforts worldwide. So he's saying we are being colonized by white exploiters. We want not just banks, we want sovereignty. Okay? We want to control our schools, our hospitals, our school boards. Okay? And then Martin Luther King, I have a little speech. So this is a lot to put on a slide. Let me just go back. In 1954, Martin Luther King takes the case in Ebony, his movement, to the black population. He has a 5 or 6 point plan on civil rights. His top 2, number 1 is coordinate community banks for boycotts. 2 is coordinate credit unions for boycotts. Number 5 is voting. Okay? So he did see community empowerment through financial capital as really relevant to the struggle. This is his I Have a Dream speech, which we focus on the wrong parts. And Reverend Al Sharpton talked about this yesterday. He says, look at the blank check. Look at this from a banking perspective. Again, he's saying, we have come to cash a check. He says, they were signing a promissory note. This note guaranteed all men, guaranteed unalienable rights. It's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note. America has given Negroes a bad check, a check which has marked back insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vault of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. This man understood how banks worked. Okay? And he is asking for a financial reckoning, a financial justice. Okay? Call it reparations, call it justice, call it what you will, but he's not asking for color blindness. He is not saying, judge me by the color. He is saying that, but he's also saying, you have deprived us of what was rightfully ours. Okay. And this is his last speech before he's assassinated. He says, he goes to Memphis, and we talk about the Memphis high on the mountaintop, but he says, I want to take your money out of the banks downtown and put them in the Tri-State Bank. We want a Bankin Movement in Memphis. I'm sure Reverend Jackson knows this movement intimately, but they were, by this time, all over Chicago, taking money out of banks, taking money out of businesses, and protesting. So there was very much an economic movement. Okay, so things get complicated. After the civil rights laws are passed, Harlem, Detroit, Watts erupts, okay? And what's happening is destruction of white property and protest against exploitation. I want to come back to this. But I do want to end on one quote that the Martin Luther King section on one quote. He says, Martin Luther King said about this segregation in the North, the underlying purpose of segregation was to oppress and exploit the segregated, not simply to keep them apart. The basic purpose of segregation was to perpetuate injustice and inequality. So going back to my earlier myth about poverty and inequality being created, Martin Luther King was very explicit about this. This is not some random thing. Okay, so everything changes. Again, there are people here who lived through this, and usually when I talk, I don't have this sort of audience, but I'll just go forward anyway and be corrected. Everything changes between 1965, when the civil rights laws are passed, and 1968. The civil rights law, the voting rights law, Brown versus Board of Ed, Montgomery bus boycott, Selma March, all of this happens before 1965. Okay? The national appetite for civil rights reform had so evaporated by 1966 that Roy Wilkins of the NAACP says it would have been hard to pass the Emancipation Proclamation in the atmosphere in 1966 and 1967. By 1969, Malcolm X, King, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy had all been killed, and Johnson is out of office. Okay? The consensus of the black community, including Reverend Jackson, about civil rights is that it's either incomplete or it has failed to account for the things that needed to be done. Okay, so yes, these laws were great, but these laws were the bare minimum.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. There's something I think that we need to know. The rise and the role of banks. Remember, after the post-Civic War, which happened somewhere around 1865, there was a bank that came, the Freedman Savings Bank. That this bank was to was created to help newly freed Black Americans save money and start business. However, the bank was mismanaged by white officials and ultimately collapsed in 1874, wiping out the savings of many black depositors. This undermined trust in financial institutions among black Americans for years, and this explains a number of things. So this start generally welcomes us to our today's presentation by an African American professor called Mesra Baradaran. She's the author of the book The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Divide, which really looks into historical and systemic factors that have contributed to the racial wealth gap in the United States while focusing on the role of banks. The book also highlights the structural inequalities, racism, and discriminatory policies that have hindered black wealth accumulation for centuries. Now, black people lost trust in banks because of the mismanagement by the white, by the white managers who were left to manage the company, the bank. That's the Freedman Savings Bank, which was established in 1865 after the post-Civic War era. And now, in today's discussion, explains a number of things as to why we are seeing black people. We saw black people lost trust in banks and savings, and this has affected the wealth gap between black people and white people. Whereas there are banks which really trusted white people, and in that they have received loans and everything, which has made them become step away from black people. While we're still grappling with trust issues because the bank, which was established by black people, was being managed by white people, and then these people mismanaged these banks. And when they mismanaged this bank, the money that black people deposited in these banks were taken away. Now, when this happened, a lot of black people lost trust in banks, and this affected their saving culture. And this explains as to why, I've been asking myself, because I've seen a lot of scholars grapple around this topic of black people don't save money, and this happened long time ago, and it really traces back. And it traces a lot of insecurities that we are seeing black people are having towards saving in different banks in the United States. So guys, in today's presentation, as I've introduced the author of the book, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Divide by Mesra Baradaran. She's so articulate, she's so beautiful, and I like the fact that she stands on business and talks about things that I believe people from the black community entirely need to hear, because this is an important topic. Financially, historically, you need to know where rain started beating us as black people, the mismanagement that happened, and also she continues to explain a number of things that are really helpful in the realm, especially when it comes to finances, wealth, and the impact of race when it comes to wealth gap between the two groups. So buckle up as we dive right into this video. And just a quick reminder, if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, join my membership, and check my Patreon. You can always, if you have inquiry, my email is in my bio. You can always reach out. Until then, let's dive right into the video. This represents Agent Tech Stories. I'll be back with my short commentary in regards to this subject.
Focus specifically on black banks, because that's what I study is banking, but also because the history of black banks sheds light on the relationships between markets and state power, which I'll talk about. So I talked about yesterday, those who were here, 3 myths about markets that I want to debunk here. The first is that money, markets, and trade exist in some realm outside of political power, okay? 2 is that inequality, this is a myth, is some natural byproduct of supply and demand of market forces as opposed to being created by state policy. 3 is that people, this is the 3rd myth, and maybe this is going to be controversial to some folks, is that people left outside of the structures of power can overcome these barriers through self-help or local institutions. So the idea is that for centuries, Black communities have been trying to overcome the racial wealth gap themselves through very smart entrepreneurship, smart banking, and have not been able to overcome those superstructures of state power. And I'll talk about those in a second. So the promise of free market capitalism is that it does not discriminate. Does not discriminate, right? So free markets offer equal opportunity for all. Racism is supposed to be inefficient. One is supposed to prosper based on one's skill and ability to produce. Yet history reveals that in fact markets do discriminate, or alternatively, and this is where I fall, that the American economy has never borne any resemblance to a free market. For most of our history, Blacks have been excluded from occupations, schools, neighborhoods, trades. Their property has not been protected by law. Money, likewise, is said to be apolitical. A revisionist history of money sort of likens money to water. It's neutral, it's colorless, it just goes here and there. In fact, the color of money for much of US history was white. White, too, was the color of government credit. In each historical moment where wealth is being created, so during the Homestead Act, FHA mortgage credit, and all of the farm loan programs, Black communities were shut out of land and wealth accumulation. That was money and wealth being created by state policy for whites, specifically for whites, right? This was embedded in the law. Moreover, and this is what my book wants to focus on, is at certain pivot points in history, Reconstruction and civil rights, where Black communities are demanding state intervention, capital, to overcome a history of injustice, the rhetoric of free market capitalism is used as a weapon. And I'll explain those 2 circumstances in a second. So self-help markets, Black banks, and Black businesses are offered as a decoy, right? They're saying, you go have your own segregated economy, okay? In other words, leaders upholding the dominance of the white market institutions promised that the market, a segregated market, would fix the problems that law backed by private violence and public violence created, okay? So law and violence created this segregation and the racial wealth gap, and the policymakers are saying markets will fix it. So this last myth is not limited to racial exclusion. I have studied and wrote about this writ large, that we use small community banks as a sort of solution to large macro problems. So we talk about microcredit, community banking, cooperatives, specifically for marginalized communities. And this goes back to Thomas Jefferson and is repeated every year with George Bailey of the, do y'all know this movie? It's a Wonderful Life. Okay, so the idea is that there's 2 different ideas of where the country is going during the founding. Hamilton pushed for a large, centralized, government-coordinated banking system. He believes that national banks and public credit, he says, is not a matter of mere private property, but a political machine of the greatest importance to the state. So Hamilton says, we're going to be a large industrial nation. We need money, and we need the government to create that money. Jefferson is fearful of federal power. One, because he needs to protect slavery. The Constitution was written by Virginian slave owners, right? So we need to take that into account. But one of Hamilton's big ideas is we need local agrarian institutions and not national and wide. He is right, though, in noticing one thing and one fear, is that when you have capital that goes anywhere it wants, it's going to conglomerate in places like New York and Chicago. So he wants to break it down and make it small so that the common man, to him, the white sort of yeoman farmer, is going to get access to this. So Jefferson is wrong in his solutions. He's wrong about where the nation is going. We are not an agrarian economy. We are an industrial power. But he was right in his nightmare scenarios. If we let banks do whatever they want, if we let money go wherever it wants, we're going to have 5 banks controlling 80% of the U.S. assets. That's what we have right now. We just had the last merger between SunTrust and BB&T. That now makes 5 or 6 banks that control the U.S. economy. That's what Jefferson feared, okay? Hamilton's solution would be, let's make it public. okay? But we're still living in Jefferson's myth. So here comes George Bailey, okay? So the idea is that a group of poor people, and imagine them as farmers or coal miners or widows, living in a free market, will pool their resources, lend to each other, and collectively lift themselves out of poverty. And this idea has unfortunately seduced both the right and the left. And this is why I say I'm going to get some hate here. Because we both pine for the noble Main Street community banker who made America great. The left focuses on the nobility of Bailey, how good he is, and he is good. He wants things besides profit. And the right focuses on how cheap and easy a solution this is to a systemic problem. So you can be the change you want to see without actually having to change anything for JP Morgan. Neoliberal reforms create these mammoth banks, all underwritten by federal subsidies, and offer a hodgepodge of microcredit fantasies for those left out. So while JP Morgan gets $900 million a year just on interest in the reserves that they hold in the Federal Reserve, this is literally money that they're parking in the Federal Reserve. They get $900 million a year. We pat them on the back when they support a microcredit institution in Bangladesh, where women are themselves pooling money and lending to each other, okay? So before you blame me for being too cynical, let me assure you that I spent the summer doing microcredit in Peru in college. And then I worked on Wall Street for 10 years, and I was at the firm that helped create the Federal Reserve's maiden lane SPVs, the special purpose vehicles, that funded the Federal Reserve trillions of dollars into AIG, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. And that was nothing like a lending circle. That was money straight from, as the Reverend said yesterday, the money tree. Right, on the money mud, which I wish I had the way with words, because I think I would rename my book Money Mud. Okay, so why am I taking this myth down? Because it is no exaggeration to say that community empowerment, in one form or another, is the foundational theory of every banking legislation over the last 30 years rooted at inequality or the racial wealth gap. We keep going back to this model. So I'm talking about the CRA, I'm talking about the CDFI, I'm talking about opportunity zones. So I'll get to those before you start throwing the tomatoes. I am going to oppose these really well-intentioned programs. These solutions are ineffective, but so clothed in goodwill that they're impossible to oppose, okay? But let me be very clear here. I have nothing against the George Baileys. Black banks especially have been at the heart of their communities. Black banks were founded by preachers, by community leaders, and leaders of the civil rights movement, okay? Martin Luther King sat on a board of a black bank, okay? Malcolm X pushed for black banking, and I'll get to those in a second. For the communities they served, black banks have been much bigger than their balance sheets. They have been a shield against economic exploitation. During the subprime crisis, no bank that I studied gave subprime loans. No black bank gave subprime loans to the communities that they served, okay? And these banks have offered, as one banker says, a quasi-crusading role. They were the symbols and sites of community boycott and protest. They have stepped into the void created by Jim Crow and segregation to offer services amid exclusion. In 2016, there's Hamilton Jefferson. 2016, Black Lives Matter and other movements associated with it created the Bank Black push. And Killer Mike explains his motivation as one of protest. He says, take your money out of the dog's mouth. Okay, so this is a different meaning of black banks that has been espoused by the activists. As community building, these institutions are amazing and irreplaceable. But to control the black dollar, they don't work. And this is what I've tried to show in the book. Banking is a network. It's a system. Okay? And so when you can take deposits from blacks and you can lend to the black community, but you can't keep that money in the economy. Because the assets, this has always been true, if the assets are owned by whites and they're using a different banking system, it's impossible to keep that money in. And I've showed it through the balance sheets. And I'm not going to go through it here because it's a little bit complex, but the book, I think, will convince you. These banks have not been able to overcome sort of the money-sucking centripetal pull of the dominant banking market. The same forces that created the need for these banks, so financial disenfranchisement, segregation, and poverty, were the same forces that impede their ability to grow wealth. Okay, so racism and housing segregation present barriers on their books. So if you look at the deposits are coming from small depositors in communities, that's very expensive for banks. Banks don't want small deposits. This is why they're giving you overdraft fees, okay? And when Bank Black started, a couple of black bankers are calling me. I work with them a lot, and they're saying these deposits are killing us. Deposits are liabilities for banks. They're mini loans that the lender wants to keep taking in and out. That is not good business, okay? Loans, look at the assets. What do banks make money on? It's the loans, okay? That's where they get the interest. And black banks have been lending on black properties. And the tragedy of black property that was true in the 1920s and is true today is that when a neighborhood turns into a black neighborhood, those property values plummet, okay? And that tipping point is somewhere between 5 to 10%, depending on what region, okay? So the first few black families come in, pay a premium, and then once it tips over, there's white flight, and those neighborhoods plummet. So that is the banking scenario on the balance sheet. And then there is the money multiplier of banks. So banks multiply money as they lend through fractional reserve banking. I won't go into, but trust me on this. The more banks lend, the more money is created, okay? The caveat is it has to be within the same system. Okay, so what black banks were doing was lending and then watching the money dissipate out of the community, okay? All right, so I'm gonna do a little quick history to demonstrate the following things. It's Black History Month, and maybe some of this history you haven't heard because people don't focus on the banks. But I wanna show one thing. Insofar as the levers of power were held by whites, hell-bent on white supremacy as labor control, and the economy was based on racial subordination, which it has been and is, markets would perpetually block capital formation from black communities. Okay, so I'll quickly pass over during Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, the freedmen were expected to make a transition from being capital to being capitalists. Freedmen and their abolitionist allies demanded land as a form of reparation and as punishment for the treasonous Confederates, right? The question was, should we hang them or just take their land, okay? Without land, Frederick Douglass and others understood that freedom and justice would be meaningless and participation in capitalism would be a farce. President Andrew Johnson vetoed the land grant and the Freedmen's Bill. He said this will be a white man's government. He reasoned, and this is where the rhetoric of capitalism comes in, that freedmen would be protected by the free market and contract law, that they would just bargain for fair wages and buy their own land. This was unbelievably naive or incredibly cynical. The Southern economy was nothing like a free market. Whites refused to sell property to blacks. Southern legislators, lawyers, and judges drafted laws governing every aspect of black labor. Their contracts were not protected. They were restricted from skilled trades. Vagrancy laws were prevalent. Wages were capped by cabal between employers, and violations led to convict labor without due process. Okay, so the legal system was manufactured not as a free market. It was another form of slavery. By the end of Reconstruction, the freedmen were landless, voteless, and with practically every profession blocked to them, their only choice was to grow cotton. But that was the point. That was the point of the whole system. The worldwide cotton market was heavily dependent on cheap and abundant cotton for the United States. As the Civil War is going on, bankers in Liverpool are worried about their cotton supply, okay? And so what had happened in Haiti, they're watching in Haiti with a very worried eye. So what happened in Haiti is when the slaves revolted and got their freedom, they got land. And what do you grow if you have your own land? You grow food to eat. Okay? You don't grow cotton. Cotton is a debt crop, it's a slave crop. In order to force people to grow cotton, you have to force them to grow cotton by making every other means unavailable. So the Southern planters and the Northern capitalists understood that if slaves got land, they would not get that cheap cotton anymore. And so they deprived them of their land. As James Baldwin called Reconstruction a bargain between the North and South to this effect. We've liberated them from the land and delivered them to their bosses. In the meantime, by the way, the federal government is giving away land through the Homestead Act to white settlers through Manifest Destiny. So instead of getting land, though, and this is the part where it gets super interesting and cynical, the freed slaves get a bank. It's called the Freedman Savings Bank. They get it in 1865, and it is sold to them as by the reformers, the Republicans and the Democrats don't oppose this, but the Republicans, the good sort of reformers say, look, this is better than land because it will teach you about thrift and saving. I mean, this is like financial education. Just you will gain land respectfully. You will earn it, as if hundreds of years under slavery was not earning the land. The Freedmen, they said, should earn the land instead of receiving it as a gift. So the Freedmen Savings Bank was the only tangible creation of the Reconstruction era Freedmen's Bureau. No bank before or since has resembled this bank. It was created by Congress, signed into law by Lincoln. The Federal Reserve was still decades away, okay? We did not have, at this time, a national currency. The greenback was just issued, okay? The bank, though, was immediately successful and embraced by all the slaves, freedmen, at this point, and a few Irish who couldn't get bank accounts at other places. The reason that this bank was successful is because those were the actual bills and notes of the bank. So at the time, if you're J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan was around then, right? These capital pots don't die. If you're J.P. Morgan and you hand a $100 note to someone, that's worth $100. If you're some podunk bank in Michigan and you give a $100 note to someone, that is not worth $100 because that person is not sure you're going to redeem it. Okay? To give notes worth $100 with Lincoln's face on it seemed to indicate, and this was their intent, that this was backed by the full faith and credit of the Treasury. It was not. It was run by white management. It was supposed to be a big savings bank. No loans. It was supposed to be like a glorified piggy bank just to keep your money safe. It did not do that. So that money, $1.5 billion in today, Henry Cook was the president. His brother was Jay Cook, infamous railroad speculator. Railroads were like the subprime market of today back then. He took $1.5 billion of money and speculated it away. So the depositors lost half of their savings that they never got back. No one got prosecuted. Nobody went to jail. W.E. Du Bois says in his magisterial Black Reconstruction, he says, not even 10 additional years of slavery could have done so much to throttle the thrift of the freedmen as the mismanagement and bankruptcy of the Freedmen's Bank, chartered by the nation for their special aid. Now, I started this project not intending to write about black banks. People are like, why did you write this? I write about the unbanked. I write about payday lending. I write about usury, all of that stuff. I started looking at FDIC data and noticing that in the South, 60%, so the unbanked and underbanked are about 10% worldwide, nationwide. So 10% of people don't have access to a bank. Bigger percent, like maybe 15%, are underbanked. In the South, for the black population, that is something like 60%, which is a phenomenally unbanked and underbanked population. And one of the main reasons they were saying, and I was looking in the interviews, is that they don't trust banks, okay? And as I dug through this history, I noticed a lot of people 100 years later talking about the Freedmen's Bank. In other words, people who lost their savings at this, government bank saying, I'm not gonna put my savings in a bank anymore. But there was another sort of dual legacy of this bank as well. I'll just skip here. After the Freedmen's Bank, there's a lot. A lot of black bankers were trained after the Freedmen's Bank. So the Freedmen's Bank fails in 1873. Between 1873 and 1910, it is heavy Jim Crow in the South, lots of hostility and violence. You have a lot of banks like Maggie Walker's bank formed during this time. Maggie Walker is the first black banker inducted into the Virginia Bankers Association because she was such a good banker. She was the first woman of any race to own her own bank. Okay, and a lot of the banks during this time resembled Maggie Walker's bank. So Maggie Walker was involved in the St. Luke's Penny Society. There was a lot of social fraternal societies, churches. So Maggie Walker starts the bank. She starts a college education fund. She gives away 600 mortgages to the people in her community. She has a printing press. She writes books. I mean, she is just everything in this community. And she also, her bank survives the Great Depression because she merges a bunch of banks into hers. There's only 5 black banks that survived the Great Depression, and hers is one of them. And she becomes the president of the National Bankers Association, which is the black banking sector. Her bank not her, but her bank survives until the 2008 financial crisis, and it's okay, so let's revel in the good history before we move on to the bad again. Okay, so during the northward migration, as you all know, millions of blacks escaping the southern hostility, but also being attracted by northern labor, cross up to the north, and they are met with heavy segregation and concentrated black populations in areas in Chicago, New York, etc. This is the heyday of black banking. About 130 banks are formed during this time. And if you're going to read the book, I would recommend, if you're not convinced that segregated banking doesn't work, read this chapter, because this is where I talk about if segregated banking is ever going to work, it is going to be between 1910 and 1930. You have 100% segregation, basically. You've got blocks that are just black, blocks that are just white or immigrant or whatever. But the scenarios are not working for these banks. Okay, so I'll move on from there. Okay, so you're seeing a lot of segregation. And then you also have banks like Chase Manhattan, right, who are taking deposits from Harlem and lending them downtown. One bank manager, I found a thesis from 1936 where he readily admits this. And he says something like, it was too risky to lend uptown because black business people are not entrepreneurial. They don't know how to run business, so therefore we're depriving them of business loans. And it reminds me of this George Bernard Shaw quote where he says, the haughty American nation makes the Negro clean its boots and then proves the moral and physical inferiority of the Negro by the fact that he is a shoe black. Okay? So they were saying, these people are not entrepreneurial, and we're not going to lend them loans. And therefore, there's no entrepreneurship because you can't start a business without a loan. Okay. So now I'm going to skip. Oh, this is the money multiplier. I'm not going to go into that right now. Okay. So then you have the New Deal, which makes segregation explicit. It restructures the U.S. banking and credit market through heavy state intervention. So I want to be clear about something. The New Deal didn't just have a blind spot on race. Okay? In other words, it's not as though they intended to help everybody and it was so racist at the time that they put, red lines around black communities. No. The New Deal was passed by the Southern legislature, who was explicit that blacks shall not be included in these things, okay? Ira Katz-Nelson, the historian, calls it white affirmative action, and it was so. So let me explain what the New Deal does. So between 1933 and 1970, hundreds and thousands of community banks, credit unions, thrifts are formed. This is the era of the George Bailey Bank. This is when we mythologize the community banker. The reason these small banks are thriving is because the New Deal takes the risk out of banking. Deposits are insured by the FDIC, so no more bank runs, and loans are subsidized by the FHA, the GI Bill, the Farm Loan Programs, and Fannie Mae. Okay? So banks, I teach my class 363 lending. Mandated by law, you're paying 3% on deposits, insured by the FDIC, 6% on loans, insured by the FHA. You're on the golf course by 3 p.m. because there's literally nothing to think about. Okay? So that is when banks are printing money. That is when George Bailey is doing the thing that he's doing. All of this built the middle class. It's not as though they gave loans to middle class people. It's that they took blue collar people from cities and said, instead of paying $50 a month on rent, pay $35 a month, and I'm using real numbers, on a mortgage in Levittown. All white mortgages, or all white communities that create the mythical America where we're trying to make America great was created through this New Deal program. In return, banks are heavily regulated. We've got interest rate caps, all sorts of stuff. The New Deal was built on redlining. Okay, so here what we're doing is we're segregating. We're saying that the communities that are green or blue are safe loans, and the FHA will insure your loan if you're lending into there. That's Chicago. The neighborhoods that are red are risky. So okay, so here's one I dug up. This is an actual, I don't know if you can see it. You might not be able to, but this is actually from Atlanta. That red area right there is Morehouse and Spelman. As you see from the top, it says, this is the best Negro neighborhood in Atlanta. It was probably the best Negro neighborhood in the country. And it says professionals, businessmen, so all men at the time, and they're homeowners. Okay, so if you look at that top thing, it says percentage. So occupation, men, clerical workers. That's very good. Foreign-born families, 0%. So that's good. Any foreign-borns like immigrants. Negro families, 100%. And then the next line is infiltration of. So what is the risk of foreign-born people and Negroes coming into this community and the percentage of risk? Okay? That is the top indicator. This is a real FHA form. And so they're saying, if you're black, you can be wealthy, you can be a university professor, you can own your house, but you are still a risk, and we will not lend to your home. Okay? So this is how segregation and the racial wealth gap is solidified in our time. So what is happening here is not just the mortgage loans. There is and these HOLC map makers, I want to be clear, these are not hooded Klansmen walking around the neighborhoods, right? These are government bureaucrats putting in law and forms. The FHA was giving manuals saying, developers, you need to try not to have a racially inharmonious neighborhood. What does racially inharmonious mean? Not fully white, okay? So you have developers being told, hey, build, and this happened in St. Louis. There was a black community that was coming too close. The infiltration of the white community was too close, and so they built a solid concrete wall that had no other purpose but to segregate one community from another. One got FHA loans, one didn't, okay? One thing that happens during this era is, and the white economy grows by leaps and bounds, and the segregated black economy becomes locked in a state of perpetual depression, as Martin Luther King calls it. Because on top of the FHA loans, there's something else that's going on. So let me go back to the maps real quick. So in the white suburb, and this is something that we don't focus on, there's also FHA consumer loans. This is the post-war era where everyone's starting to buy a car, a refrigerator. I mean, this is the era where, like, truly America is great. We're coming back from the war. We're buying all sorts of stuff for our house, and we're buying it on credit. We're buying it on cheap credit. In the white suburb where wealth is accumulating, and wealth is accumulating fast, by the way, because these houses are increasing in value. And, oh, by the way, the men that are coming back from the war are going to college with a GI Bill. Black soldiers either get it or don't get it because there aren't universities that will accept them. But that's another story. So what's happening as the wealth is building up is that there's also a consumer credit market that is built atop of the mortgage credit market. So consumer credit is the money you use to buy your couch, your TV, and your, not TV, I don't know, refrigerator. Okay. So in the white suburb, they're using revolving credit. And revolving credit is like a credit card, okay? And what revolving credit allows you to do is have a credit card or your Woolworth's card or whatever, and you can go to any store, and the revolving credit, how it works in the credit markets is you can sell it up to the secondary markets. Remember I talked about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? One of the things that's really interesting about credit is it's becoming securitized during this time. So what securitized credit means is that you're lowering the risk. You're bundling a whole bunch of people's credit risks, and you're allowing more capital to flow in the system. This is happening with consumer credit in the white suburb and revolving credit. Revolving credit is low interest. It's highly flexible. In the black ghetto, and I'm going to call it ghetto because that is the term that people used at the time. It was not a black neighborhood because that would imply that it was chosen freely. It was not. It was backed again by violence and power. So in the black ghetto, what's happening is not revolving credit, not just because of racism, but because of the different market structure and wealth. So what's happening in the black ghetto is installment credit. And installment credit is night and day from revolving credit. What is installment credit? Is you're buying your refrigerator, same item, you're paying 10 to 20 times more for the product. So think of Rent-A-Center. That was the only credit available in the ghetto. And you're paying your hospital bill, your doctor, your school tuition, if you have one, through installment. And what installment means, the way that they would put these contracts together is they would bundle all the payments into one contract. And if you missed, let's say you're buying a refrigerator and a couch and a car or whatever, you're bundling them all together. And if you miss one payment, you lose everything. Okay, and the interest rates were incredibly high. So I want to, and the default, involves repo men, cops. It's not a default like you would get a creditor calling you. They're showing up at your house. They're taking your stuff. Okay, so before there was a Montgomery bus boycott, groups in Harlem and Chicago are protesting these arrangements, these installment lenders, okay? In Harlem, boycotts are even sanctioned by the court. So there's a court decision in 1935 that opens up the room for Martin Luther King's boycott movement. So this judge in Harlem says, so a bunch of people are boycotting these installment lenders, black activists, and this judge and the business is saying, this is illegal. You can't boycott us for racism. And the judge says, absolutely you can. So this opens up the door for community boycotts, the type that Reverend Jackson really sort of used to great effect in Chicago. But this court decision allows for this. But they're focusing on the money issue, as Reverend Jackson and other early civil rights leaders did as well. So they saw economic autonomy that's going hand in hand with civil rights. So this is Malcolm X. Why should white, and of course, a black nationalist, that makes sense. Why should white people be running the banks of our community? So he wants autonomy. But let me be clear here. When Malcolm X was talking about autonomy, he saw the ghetto as a colony. Okay? He linked up the black ghetto with the anti-colonialization efforts worldwide. So he's saying we are being colonized by white exploiters. We want not just banks, we want sovereignty. Okay? We want to control our schools, our hospitals, our school boards. Okay? And then Martin Luther King, I have a little speech. So this is a lot to put on a slide. Let me just go back. In 1954, Martin Luther King takes the case in Ebony, his movement, to the black population. He has a 5 or 6 point plan on civil rights. His top 2, number 1 is coordinate community banks for boycotts. 2 is coordinate credit unions for boycotts. Number 5 is voting. Okay? So he did see community empowerment through financial capital as really relevant to the struggle. This is his I Have a Dream speech, which we focus on the wrong parts. And Reverend Al Sharpton talked about this yesterday. He says, look at the blank check. Look at this from a banking perspective. Again, he's saying, we have come to cash a check. He says, they were signing a promissory note. This note guaranteed all men, guaranteed unalienable rights. It's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note. America has given Negroes a bad check, a check which has marked back insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vault of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. This man understood how banks worked. Okay? And he is asking for a financial reckoning, a financial justice. Okay? Call it reparations, call it justice, call it what you will, but he's not asking for color blindness. He is not saying, judge me by the color. He is saying that, but he's also saying, you have deprived us of what was rightfully ours. Okay. And this is his last speech before he's assassinated. He says, he goes to Memphis, and we talk about the Memphis high on a mountaintop, but he says, I want to take your money out of the banks downtown and put them in the Tri-State Bank. We want a Bankin Movement in Memphis. I'm sure Reverend Jackson knows this movement intimately, but they were, by this time, all over Chicago, taking money out of banks, taking money out of businesses, and protesting. So there was very much an economic movement. Okay, so things get complicated. After the civil rights laws are passed, Harlem, Detroit, Watts erupts, okay? And what's happening is destruction of white property and protest against exploitation. I want to come back to this. But I do want to end on one quote that the Martin Luther King section on one quote. He says, Martin Luther King said about this segregation in the North, the underlying purpose of segregation was to oppress and exploit the segregated, not simply to keep them apart. The basic purpose of segregation was to perpetuate injustice and inequality. So going back to my earlier myth about poverty and inequality being created, Martin Luther King was very explicit about this. This is not some random thing. Okay, so everything changes. Again, there are people here who lived through this, and usually when I talk, I don't have this sort of audience, but I'll just go forward anyway and be corrected. Everything changes between 1965, when the Civil Rights Laws are passed, and 1968. The Civil Rights Law, the Voting Rights Law, Brown versus Board of Ed, Montgomery bus boycott, Selma March, all of this happens before 1965. Okay? The national appetite for civil rights reform had so evaporated by 1966 that Roy Wilkins of the NAACP says it would have been hard to pass the Emancipation Proclamation in the atmosphere in 1966 and 1967. By 1969, Malcolm X, King, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy had all been killed, and Johnson is out of office. Okay? The consensus of the black community, including Reverend Jackson, about civil rights is that it's either incomplete or it has failed to account for the things that needed to be done. Okay, so yes, these laws were great, but these laws were the bare minimum. All the civil rights laws did was to guarantee to the black population the rights they were already supposed to be guaranteed in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Okay, so this is now just saying we're serious this time, and the federal government's going to back it up. Okay, the whites-only signs are gone, but the Federal Reserve does a study in 1967 that says blacks have 1/5 the wealth of white families, and half of black children are growing up in deep poverty, compared to 9% of white children. So these protests erupt, and people think of it as a domestic war, right? A CBS announcement says it's an insurrection against all authority, and there's a bunch of commissions that convene to study these riots. What is the purpose? We're so confused. Why are you complaining? Okay, so the Kerner Commission that is convened by President Johnson says, it's scathing. It says, what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. Yep. White institutions created it, yep. White institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. Yep. Then there's these hearings in the Senate Banking Committee, of which some members will come later. Senate, well, they're the House members, but in the Banking Committee, they study these riots specifically. And they find three things. I'm going to have to be quick here. Three things about these riots. One is that the rioters are targeting the lenders, and they're saying things like burn the books. Okay, this is not random violence. They know who their exploiters are. Two is that they're leaving alone black businesses, or what Jacob Javits calls soul brother establishments. And three, and this is supported by all of the studies, and this is going to sound complicated and a little bit crazy, but these lenders aren't making profits. Okay? 95% of that high cost of lending is because they're operating in a different market. They have higher defaults, there's lower wealth. All of the mix of conditions created by the FHA maps makes it such that these bankers cannot. Okay, so the response is, by a lot of policymakers, we'll throw more black lenders in, and that'll fix it. Okay? Instead of actual capital or integration or whatever, we're just going to have more black banks. Okay, so the winning candidate here is Richard Nixon, who can't say this is a white man's government like Andrew Johnson did, but is essentially saying that. Okay, he rides a white backlash into office. He takes the language of the Black Power movement and uses it to propose his civil rights agenda. And I've been in the Nixon archives for months. Everyone wants to look at the Vietnam stuff, and I'm looking at the campaign materials. And the stuff that these guys wrote in paper is phenomenally astounding. So he writes a memo to Congress saying, I promise to lay off the Negro crap. Okay? He understands that he is not going to get any political points for pushing forward on civil rights. So he uses black capitalism. This is his campaign announcement. I usually play it. Let me see if it'll let me. I don't know if it will. Yes. I don't know if I'm complicating it by doing this, but. Oh, no. Okay, here it is.
Richard Nixon speaks on black capitalism. It's no longer enough that white-owned enterprises employ greater number of Negroes, whether as laborers or middle management personnel. This is needed, but it has to be accompanied by an expansion of black ownership, of black capitalism. We need more black employers, more black businesses. Integration must come, but in order for it to come on a sound and equal basis, the black community has to be built from within, even as the old barriers between black and white are dismantled from without. We have to get private enterprise into the ghetto, but at the same time.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so one interesting thing on that last point, he says it's time to move past the old civil rights. In the archives, there's 5 different drafts of this speech, and in the first several, it says, forget civil rights, right? And then someone puts move beyond, and then someone puts it's time to move past the old civil rights. The message is the same. We're not pushing forward on civil rights. One interesting side note on this is George Romney is his HUD commissioner, and George Romney, when you hear George Romney, it's talking about segregation, it's almost like hearing the Black Panthers, okay? He says the white suburb is like a noose around the black ghetto. This is George Romney. And he pushes several integration plans, and finally Nixon, after 2 years, sends him to Mexico and makes him leave. Okay, so what is black capitalism? Nixon co-opts black power, and what he does is he puts treasury deposits into banks. He starts affirmative action. He asks businesses politely to hire more black people, all great. And he also starts set-asides, contract set-asides to black businesses. That gets, the Supreme Court sort of puts that aside. Why does this matter? Okay, so I gotta wrap up. I can't go through all of the interesting things that happened after Nixon, but I'll just be quickly. Ronald Reagan really takes this message. So let me just go back to the intellectual apparatus here. So Milton Friedman, Lewis Powell, John Olen, the Olen Foundation, is one of the biggest funders of right-wing groups here. Alan Greenspan was the Fed chairman. Lewis Powell writes this thing called the Powell Memo that teaches the right how to oppose the left. So the theory that I put in the book is Milton. So these we call them neoliberal, libertarian. Barry Goldwater is one of their standard bearers. Nixon becomes their sort of executor in chief. These guys push forward the free market capitalism that you see pervading everything. Let markets do it. Deregulate. Government bad. Markets good. Okay. I think I demonstrate in the book that these men were reacting specifically to the civil rights demands for capital. Because what you see in this moment, these ideas are out there, have been for a while. As soon as black communities say, we would like a cut of what you all have been doing in the other markets, what Nixon and Greenspan come back with is capitalism. Capitalism will fix it. This is what Andrew Johnson did in the early Reconstruction as well. And it's very explicit. So Greenspan writes memos to Nixon. And I showed these in the book. I hope I can convince you. But Greenspan writes Nixon and says, about the urban riots, anything you do, either reparations or integration, is anti-capitalist. We're going to head down to the road of communism if you respond in any other way. John Olen goes to the Cornell campus for Alumni Day and sees the Black Power protests, and that's when he starts the Olen Foundation to fund these right-wing groups. Milton Friedman opposes the civil rights laws because he says they're just like the Nuremberg codes, they're market intervention. Lewis Powell organizes the right to fight all civil rights advances. Okay, so the reason why this matters is because we are still living in this reality, okay? These people still control all of the rhetoric about markets. The word efficiency, the word, profits, markets, all of that stuff is relatively new, okay? So Reagan starts black-owned business. I'm not gonna leave alone the Democrats. I'm very sorry about this. Clinton doubles down on this. So he starts a CDFI fund, uses Shore Bank and microcredit as this is a little clip I won't play because I'm out of time. He does a clip about microcredit. So Muhammad Yunus, the Grameen Bank, comes to Shore Bank, is motivated there. And he says Clinton's whole big economic agenda is community empowerment. So when we were calling black communities the ghetto, now we're calling them empowerment zones, niche markets. And I'm going to make a lot of enemies here, but Cory Booker just called them, it's too good to pass up, domestic emerging markets. Okay? Lawrence Summers, Clinton's advisor, says this is win-win. The entrepreneurs will come and they will find the profits that have been laying on the ground this whole time. Okay? They're niche markets. We're going to use indigenous lenders to fix this. Okay? This is, again, problems created by segregation and public policy. And the assumption here is that black bankers haven't been trying for hundreds of years to wring profits from these neighborhoods and dealing with this radically different structure. So these are the policy. Barack Obama didn't do all that much. Trump, opportunity zones. I didn't get to further the slide here. So this whole infrastructure that Nixon created as part of his Southern strategy, his strategy was law and order, but the other side was black capitalism. And with black capitalism, we haven't probed as much of because it's harder to dig at what is going on here. And I want to tell you that what's going on is that instead of responding to the civil rights movement's demands, they gave this other thing. They were asking for bread and they got a stone. And this stone has not yielded profits. It's impossible to, because what you're saying is we're going to keep segregation intact. You're not going to have capital. So Hubert Humphrey, opposing Nixon, says you can't have black capitalism without capital. But that's exactly what Nixon was doing. In fact, one of his advisors, Abe Venable, who was the head of OMBE, the only African American who was hired, he was the highest ranked, did a plan, $8 billion in capital to these areas. And Maurice Sands, who's the Commerce Department chair of Nixon, writes him and says, no, this is not about money, you don't understand. And I'm quoting here. He says, we need stories of black entrepreneurs. We need, what the black people need more than anything else is stories of success, okay? And he talks about Horatio Alger, right? So we need to motivate people to do this stuff and not actually give them capital. Okay. Maybe I'll close here because I really do have to stop. The errors, we have used in our history several dogmas to justify racial exploitation and inequality. So during slavery, we bastardized Christianity, right? Or the white slave owners did, not we. But they said that God created the white man as capital and the black man as labor. This is word for word, what they're saying. That God deemed the white man to be the owner of the black man. That was the myth that justified in slavery. Slavery. Then after those myths go out, then we're using social Darwinism, right? The pseudoscience of, we've measured skulls and bodies, and it looks like the white man, and not just all white men, not the Irish, the white man is just, nature's highest order, the most evolved being, and then down, and we've got these scientific measurements. There was one insurance company, this is why black insurance was the only successful market, is that insurers used this data to say, and I kid you not, that the black race was going extinct because of their health problems. And they said, this is not caused by poverty and labor, this is a racial trait. Okay? So that is used, and then that falls out of favor because the Nazis kind of put that to use, right? They're like, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then the Americans couldn't do it. I want to claim that now what we're using to justify inequality is the laws of the market, okay? Which has replaced the laws of God. So economic theory, the laws of supply and demand, are a reason that black labor is undervalued and credit costs so much. Any effort to change these markets is harmful government interference with what Reagan called the magic of the marketplace. And just as God's will was difficult to oppose in the 1700s, so too, if you oppose the markets, you're labeled as a heretic, a communist, a socialist. But what I hope I've showed, and I hope I can show in the book, is that it's never been a free market. It has always been a mixed market of federal government subsidies and some markets. The only place, actually, where there has never been a subsidy is in the black ghetto. Now there's a little bit more, but taking into account the FHA, the Homestead Acts, and all of the other government programs before it, it has only been the black ghettos where the cost of credit has been paid by the people. Other places it's been underscored. So if we're going to talk about markets, let's talk about markets. But if we're not talking about markets, then let's call it what it is. So I will end there. There's a lot more, and I'm running out of time, so I'm sorry. Thank you.
So we're grateful for.
So there was a need of the rise of the black banks, the rise and the role of black banks, and I remember telling you the Freedman Savings Bank, which was established in 1865 after the Civil War era. Right now, you know what happened, and a lot of black people deposited their money in these banks. They all disappeared, and this has made black people not to trust a number of banks, and this has affected their growth and other things, because white people are leveraging on the bank while we are still losing trust in the banks that definitely were set up to make us grow as a community. Now, segregation and the need for black banks. As Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation in South and the de facto segregation spread in the North, black Americans were often excluded from mainstream white-owned banks. This led to creation of black-owned banks, which aimed to provide African Americans with access to credit, mortgage, and other financial services. These banks played a critical role in black communities by supporting local businesses and home ownership. And I'm going to be explaining something in regards to this. The sister said, you are seeing a number of black people just creating their own job, standing by their own self without depending on the loans from the bank, because it's not accessible to them, whereas it's accessible to white people. And this shows you how also some failures of these black banks, which was managed by white people, has led to fear of also losing money through giving loans to black people, giving credits to black people. And this really shows a number of things and makes me want to discuss challenges faced by black banks despite their impotence. They have faced enormous obstacles that Dr. Mensra tries to explain, that I believe that it is important. So, lack of capital. Black banks often struggle with limited capital because of customers generally had fewer assets. Redlining. The federal government and private banks engage in redlining, refusing to lend black community, especially for mortgages. This limited the ability of black banks to help communities build wealth through home ownership. And this has explained why we are seeing the racial wealth divide between black people and white people. In as much as the Civil War era ended, and now black people wanted their own as a result of Jim Crow, because Jim Crow segregated black people from white people. This includes bank, churches, name it all, right? Now they came up with their own banks. After coming up with their own banks, there was a problem. I don't know who managed the banks, but according to history, it was the white people that managed the bank, and this led to its failure. And when it failed, also other banks seeing the black banks failing, they were so afraid in lending black people their resources, and this was termed as redlining, and this has affected how white people and black people have used money or credit from the bank to leverage to create their own wealth. And this explains increased racial wealth gap between black people and white people, especially in the United States. Not forgetting the systematic racism. White-owned banks and federal government often refuse to invest or support black banks, further hindering their growth. And reason, I've just explained the reason, and you know that now. During the 1930s, there was the New Deal and housing policies, which later on came, right? Now, during the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt New Deal aimed to lift Americans out of poverty, but black Americans were largely excluded from its benefit. Again, this explains why you're seeing the enormous racial wealth gap, right? Now, programs like Home Owners Loan Corporation and Federal Housing Administration, that's FHA, extended credit to white homeowners while denying black people from the same opportunities. The FHA policies explicitly favored segregated neighborhoods, promoting white suburban home ownership and excluding black neighborhoods from receiving mortgages, a practice known as redlining, and I've explained it initially. Now, during the post-World War II suburban boom, after World War II, the GI Bill helped returning soldiers buy homes and attend college. However, black veterans were often denied these benefits, and this explains why also we are still having this racial divide. Black soldiers were told, go to war. When you come back, we have a lot of things that we have planned to you. So when you come back, these black soldiers came back to nothing, literally nothing that they could keep their hands on. And this explains why some of the black early ancestors who went to the World War II to fight for their country, being promised that, if you come back, we will give you land, you will have opportunities. The black veterans were often denied these benefits that their white counterparts were given. You understand? So, as white Americans moved to suburbs and build wealth through home ownership, black families were confined to segregated urban neighborhoods with deteriorating housing and fewer economic opportunities. This disparity contributed to widening of racial wealth gap. Nobody could explain it better than these articles that tries to describe the New Deal and housing policies. Now, the civil rights era and economic struggles, that's now 1950s to 1960s. Civil rights movements, that is 1950s to 1960s, while the civil rights movement achieved significant victories in dismantling legal segregation. The economic goals of the movements, like addressing wealth disparities and economic inequality, were largely unmet. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders recognized that without economic justice, racial equality will remain elusive. And I think at some point he talked about this. Now, we still have Reinvestment Act, which was proposed in 1977 in response to redlining and other discriminatory bank practices, Now, the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, in response to redlining and other discriminatory bank practices, the Community Reinvestment Act, that the CRA, was passed to encourage banks to lend in low-income and minority communities. However, the effects of redlining persisted, and black communities continued to face barriers accessing credits and loans, making it so hard for them to still create wealth, regardless of civil rights era and the economic ways that these people try to come up with. Now, black capitalism and the limits of bank. Now we are going to 1970s now. Nixon Black Capitalism Initiative, which was done in 1970. President Richard Nixon promoted black capitalism as a way to empower black communities economically. This led to a focus of black entrepreneurship and the growth of black banks. However, Baradaran argues that black capitalism was limited in its ability to close the wealth gap. Black banks and business were often undercapitalized and operated in economic disadvantaged communities, making it difficult for them to succeed. In as much as we were still seeing black capitalism happening, that's now in 1970, I would say that the arm was now too big to be cured. White people had already accumulated a lot of wealth. Now it's when we are seeing new president in the US coming and saying, now we need to promote minority groups. We need to start giving them loans and everything. But it is too late, right? And this didn't help even curb the problem. Okay, we could say it curbed a little, but it didn't curb the major part, because as white people had already accumulated different wealth for a long time as compared to black people. Sips water. So my next point is inherent limitation. While black-owned banks were crucial in providing financial services to African Americans, they were often constrained by the very communities they served. Since these communities were historically under-resourced, black banks could not accumulate sufficient capital to compete with larger white-owned institutions. Moreover, black banks could not address the larger systemic issues like redlining that continued to block black wealth accumulation. Now we are going to 1980s to 2000s, right? Wealth stripping and predatory lending. Now, these people say that, okay, you've said that you need this, you need this money, okay? You need this, you need this credit, you need us to lend you. Now this is what we're gonna do. they started wealth stripping and predatory lending. That's the 1980s to 2000s. Deindustrialization and decline of urban economies. As manufacturing jobs disappeared from urban areas in the late 20th century, many black families lost stable employment and faced increasing economic instability. This further undermined their efforts to build wealth in the black communities. Therefore, in the 1990s and the year 2000, as black families began to gain access to credit, they were often targeted by predatory lenders. Subprime mortgages were disproportionately marketed to black families, even those who qualified for prime loans. When the housing market collapsed in the year 2008, and this was so historical, black homeowners were hit hardest, losing the disproportionate amount of their wealth during the foreclosure crisis. So sorry about that day. Now, till today, we're still looking at the present-day racial wealth gap, the enduring gap. Today, the racial wealth gap remains enormous. On average, a typical white family has nearly 10 times wealth typical of a black family. Much of this disparity is rooted in the historical exclusion of black Americans from ownership, education, and wealth building opportunities. Systemic solutions. Baradan argues that black banks also can close their racial wealth gap. Systemic solutions are needed, including reparation policies that directly address wealth inequality and reforms to bank and lending practices to ensure that black Americans have equal capital access. This is a presenter Eugene Jack Stories. I hope that this video serves you right. And again, I'll say, the presenter of this video is called Mesra Baradaran. The Color of Money, that's her book. I hope if you find time, go buy the book. If you're watching this video again for the first time, I remind you to subscribe to the channel, join the membership, like the video, and you can also check out my Patreon. If you have a question, feel free to reach me through my email is on my bio. Until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.